Para você ver qual é a simpatia aqui, né?
Why not?
Quem é o mais simpático?
Entre.
Go. Yeah. What? I didn't do a thing. I didn't do a thing. Did I? No, but okay, it's there. It's back. Well, good afternoon. My name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. On behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you all here. Welcome also those who are watching this on television or their computers. Today we have the honor, and I have the great pleasure to welcome to the Brazil Institute Professor Riordan Roett, who has been a great friend, a sort of a mentor to me in the many years I have been here as a journalist and now at the Wilson Center. Riordan has really been in our case in Brazil for a number of years, since the 60s actually. We are here to listen to him talk about his new book called The New Brazil, which is a very, very interesting book because it presents in a concise and very intelligent way, as everything he does, you know, an interpretation of Brazil, how we got to where we are, and the challenges ahead. I highly recommend that you buy this book and that you read it. Riordan has, as I mentioned, been following Brazilian issues for about 50 years. There were times that we messed up so much that he got angry with us, and then he studied other countries, but he always comes back home. So, and it's Riordan is really an honor for me, and Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program here and a former student of Riordan's, could not be here. I hope she emailed you. And with that, I would like to give you the mic so you make a presentation, and then we are going to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo, for the invitation. I appreciate it. I'll be relatively brief because there are a number of people around the table who know Brazil, and it would be more interesting to talk about your impressions or questions about the New Brazil, not just my book, but the New Brazil, which I think exists. Let me say what the book is not about. I've had great arguments by email with my Brazilian colleagues about this. It is not a defense of or in praise of the PT and Lula. Although the 8 years of Lula have made it very possible for the New Brazil to appear. So it is not an interpretation of the PT government. It is an analysis of Brazil's rise as a new player in global affairs, which just happened to have taken place during 16 years, 8 of which were divided with Cardoso, 8 of which were divided with Lula. They can't agree who's more important. Each one thinks he is, but that's Brazil. It is not a traditional history of Brazil. There are some excellent traditional histories of Brazil, but clearly you can't talk about the New Brazil without talking about the old Brazil. Contrasts are rather sharp, so there is a section on history. It's not an effort to support the decline school of American foreign policy. But if you followed the World Bank IMF meetings this weekend, as I did here in Washington, D.C., if it's not decline, it is certainly a somewhat marginalized U.S. having to make space for the emerging market countries on the board of the International Monetary Fund by the meeting in Seoul in November, or there's going to be hell to pay. And also, it's not an argument that because of the general emergence of new players, they are going to take over the world. They're not. This is not a hegemonic monolith, the BRICs, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The traditional order is in place. It is being changed very slowly. It needs to yield to new players with global aspirations. And in power cycle theory, what we're watching is whether or not the decline on this side of the Bretton Woods countries and the rise of the emerging market economies will be done peacefully with complementarities, or is it going to have some difficult and rough edges as U.S. relations with China indicate might happen. I should also put forth a disclaimer that I'm not trying to airbrush Brazil. Brazil has a current account deficit of about $50 billion a year, about 3% of GDP, which is probably in the medium, long-term unsustainable. The strong appreciation of the Brazilian real has hurt exporters, and that's obviously important to the image of Brazil as a BRIC. Very heavy and complex, as we all know, tax burden that nobody seems to know what to do about, but everyone complains about. Creaking physical infrastructure. Any of us who know Brazil probably thinks there are less paved roads now than when I went to Brazil in 1962. But to get to 2014 and 2016, somebody is going to have to do something about the physical infrastructure, or Brazil is going to look like India with the Commonwealth Games in 2014 and 2016. A very poor educational system, although the educational system for the well-to-do, the alta burguesia, is excellent. The educational system for people who are not alta burguesia is miserable, and that has been a situation that has occurred for a number of decades. But with all the good acts and motions of the Bolsa Familia and Lula, more than 1/5 of the country's 200 million people are still officially considered poor. But as the economist pointed out, Brazil does not have India's religious divisions, Chinese authoritarianism, or Russia's ambivalent relations with the West. And as the FT said recently at the Financial Times, it is less scary than China, less authoritarian than Russia, and less chaotic than India, which is a nice way of characterizing Brazil in 2010. Why is Brazil the new Brazil and not the old Brazil? And for those of us who have been around, and some of you have been with me around the table over time, we talked about this before under the military regime in the 1970s, and we talked about grandeza. Brazil was going to be a great country. That collapsed for all kinds of interesting reasons, which I go into in the book. This is not a grandeza period, although some people have called it a period of irrational exuberance, borrowing from a famous economist, that Brazil may be thinking too much out of the box and not enough in the box. That remains to be seen with the new administration that comes into office on January 1st. And I don't make any predictions anymore, all of us having been burnt on October 3rd about what we thought the outcome of the election was going to be. All the analysts who made comments on it to the press and media have egg on our face. So basically I'm saying that we want Marina Silva to come back and run again, and she may indeed win. In just the past few weeks, it's been reported, and this I think is the substantive basis for looking at Brazil as a BRIC, that Brazil's foreign reserves have now surpassed $250 billion. Brazil can now loan money to the International Monetary Fund. Now, this is an extraordinary decision, or better, occurrence for the government of Brazil, which never had any foreign reserves to talk about. As you know, the pre-salt finds off the southeast coast are really quite staggering. And every few months we find, or Brazil finds, a new discovery, a new patch of oil. Big questions about the cost, the technology, deep water drilling, market prices, market access. But quite clearly, if this takes off, and I think it will, Brazil will be in a position to be one of the top 5 or 7 oil producers. Already it's independent in the world by 2015, if not a few years before. Big question, does Brazil then become Norway or Nigeria? We hope a combination of Brazil and Norway, not a combination of Brazil and Nigeria. The reason to believe it will be handled well is, one, Petrobras is a very efficient company. It is run by very efficient and competent people. Whomever wins the election on last Sunday understands the importance of the oil income, the social trust fund, the division of the revenues among the states, still to be decided, a very delicate issue, but one I think that really is very much on the psyche of the Brazilian national political leadership, and I don't think they're going to mess up the pre-salt findings. But one never knows. Brazil, of course, recently dazzled global finance, as the newspaper reported, when in very late September, Petrobras raised a $67 billion share offering, roughly equivalent to the annual economic output of a reasonably sized country like Iraq. It was the biggest share issue ever undertaken in the world. $67 billion. And it went off like that. absolutely no problems placing that much money in the market. Now, there are downsides to that much money being placed in the market, and we hope the Brazilian central bank understands that. Brazil has the world's 8th biggest bank by market capitalization, Itaú Unibanco. And the BNDES, the development bank, has a balance sheet larger than that of the World Bank. Think of that. A larger balance sheet than the World Bank. And the BNDES will be behind 2014 and 2016 in terms of moving Brazil to make the investments in the physical infrastructure that will be needed. Now, one can argue the BNDES, and there are many arguments out there, has become too powerful, it's a state within a state. That may or may not be true. That's not the topic of my book. That's another issue we decided after January 1st. But it's a very interesting issue that you combine these numbers that I've just been mentioning, $67 billion on the market, the reserve numbers of $250 billion and moving upward, the 8th largest bank by capitalization in the world, and the BNDES having more money than the World Bank. We also know on the energy side, Brazil is a very powerful country, but what's often overlooked is that Brazil doesn't just export coffee and sugar anymore. Now, Brazil is now the world's biggest exporter, not only of coffee and sugar, but of orange juice, tobacco, ethanol, beef, chicken, and the second biggest source of soya products. And most importantly, in terms of policy, which the book does go into in great detail, it's really impossible to talk about global climate change post-Copenhagen without Brazil being at the table. You may remember in December last year in Copenhagen, President Obama had to knock on the door and ask to be admitted to the final round of drafting the communique. Who was sitting at the table? President Lula, Hu Jintao, Prime Minister of India, and the President of South Africa. The U.S. was last invited to the table. We had to invite ourselves. Nothing personal, I don't think, in that, but that the developing countries, the BRIC countries, and one or two others are very much aware of the need they must be included in whatever is going to come out of Cancun, which not much will come out of Cancun this year, but moving down the road, any country that controls the Amazon is indeed going to be at the table when we finally talk about environmental protection and the number of other important issues linked to it. When the financial crisis began, this financial crisis, it didn't begin in the emerging markets the way it did in 2007. When Thailand collapsed, Russia collapsed in 2008, Brazil collapsed in 2009, Mexico collapsed in 1994. The collapse began where? In New York City, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, of Merrill Lynch, and the others. Why? Because the U.S. didn't bother regulating for almost a decade, didn't really know what was going on with mortgages, had no idea of what derivatives were, and many of the other interesting issues that were being used to make young men and women, many of whom were my students, multimillionaires in a very few number of years. Lula has spoken out on this very, very strongly, that Brazil was the last country, emerging market country, into the crisis and the first country out. Why? Because Brazil did learn a lesson from 1999, redid the banking system, upped the capitalization, put in a regulatory framework. You don't have derivatives and these kinds of instruments being produced by Brazilian banks. And this is also true of the more or less of the other BRIC countries. So beginning at the end of 2008, the lame duck George W. Bush administration called the G20 back into life rather than the G7. This is one of those interesting changes. G7 doesn't run the world anymore. The G20 does. And the G20 have met frequently, and they will go on meeting frequently. And one of the major spokespeople for the interest of the G20 is Brazil. The foreign minister of Brazil and the finance minister have been front and center after Washington, which was really a lame duck session of the G20, most importantly in London the following year, then in Pittsburgh, Toronto recently, and in Seoul, key meeting coming up in November of this year. So there really can't be any new financial architecture, which was the debate this weekend at the meetings I went to of the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, without talking about a redistribution, as my friend Fred Bergson says, of the shares and chairs. That is, the Europeans will have to step back from the table at the International Monetary Fund and open space and more voting power for the emerging market countries, of which the most important are Brazil, China, and India. And the scuttlebutt is that those three countries plus South Africa and one or two others are going to push for an additional 5 to 6% for the emerging market countries. There is also a matter of honesty among thieves in that 2 years ago in Singapore, the decision was already made to redistribute 5%. It's never been confirmed. So there is now a 10% redistribution on the table, probably in Seoul. The poor Sherpas who prepare these meetings, I gather, are turning apoplectic in Seoul, trying to figure out how you meet the demands of Brazil, China, and India. The final area in which you can't move forward is trade. Brazil is a very important trading partner. It's an extraordinarily important trading country at the present time. But in the famous 2001 Doha round of the World Trade Organization, Brazil, China, and India made it very clear that they were not going to negotiate unless there was a level playing field. There was no level playing field because the U.S. and the EU insist on protecting domestic agricultural producers. And unless that issue is resolved, the Brazilians and the Chinese and the Indians are not going to come back to the table. And the negotiations collapsed in July 2008 in Geneva, precisely by drawing a line in the sand in terms of that protection for agricultural workers. Now, what's interesting, and again, my argument that this is not a monolithic organization, not an organization at all, the BRICs, Brazil was willing to compromise and take some steps toward the EU and the U.S., which is very important, I think, to understand. These countries are not walking in lockstep. On some issues there'll be changes, some issues there'll be disagreement, but in general there are complementarities that bring them together. Brazil, as you may know, hosted the second BRIC summit in April this year in Brasilia. At the same time, President Lula presided over a second summit, that of IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. Brazil's commitment to South-South diplomacy and its commitment to basically beginning to expand its foreign policy and geopolitical framework is a very important part of the dynamics of Brazil as a BRIC. As you may know, there's been a discordant note between the United States and Brazil. Unfortunately, I still find my colleagues in Washington thinking that Brazil should lose sleep at night because Washington doesn't like what Brazil does. Those days are over too, by the way. And the discord primarily is over the visit of President Lula with the Prime Minister of Turkey to Iran, trying to convince the Iranian government to accept, before sanctions, to accept a resolution of the issue over the use of nuclear materials. That didn't work. There are a lot of misunderstandings on both sides. When the sanctions finally came up for a vote, Brazil voted no. As a result, there was a certain pettiness that's come into Washington's dialogue. Secretary Clinton gave a major foreign policy talk, I gather she thought it was major, at the Council on Foreign Relations a few weeks ago, in which she went over the whole panoply of U.S. relations around the world, very much talking as the only superpower left in the world. And then, rather condescendingly, said, well, we also must consider regional partners and issues such as Russia, India, China. We all sat there waiting. Of course she's going to say B, Brazil. No mention of Brazil. Why? I found out from a very reliable source that it was over the vote in the United Nations. So, talking to my friends in Itamaraty, the foreign ministry, they did not lose any sleep over Secretary Clinton not mentioning them in her speech at the Council on Foreign Relations. Things are moving very quickly and they're changing very dramatically. Now, we always thought that poor little countries like Brazil and India really can't develop. That was the development dialogue when I first went to graduate school. You had to be just like us, or really you were nowhere in the international system. Well, what's happened, of course, I'm not talking about India or China, that's a very different issue, is that Class C, which is the middle class in Brazil, not like our middle class, but the equivalent in Brazil of the middle class, has increased by 30 million people under President Lula, from 34% to 49% of the Brazilian adult population. That, in large part, is what's driving the Brazilian consumer society at the present time. Now, last year, there are now 92, almost 93 billion people in the C class, which means that every major company in the world, the Forbes 500, wants to be in Brazil, because if the growth continues, and it should not, I hope it will not continue at 7 or 8%, 5% would just be fine. That still means you've got a very large consumer society. So suddenly, because of the Bolsa Familia, because of low inflation, because of inflation targeting, because of a whole series of policies that began in 1994 with Fernando Henrique Cardoso and continued by President Lula, with a few blips on either side of the transition in 2002, what you have is a new Brazil. You suddenly have, for the first time since Mr. Cabral arrived in 1500, a group in Brazil, increasingly large, that is moving out of poverty. Not out of inequality. Inequality is Latin America's worst problem, but out of poverty. They are becoming consumers. And the conditional cash transfer programs, Bolsa Familia, the family transfer program, has been extraordinarily important politically, but socially and economically as well. So suddenly, for the first time, we can look at Brazil in very different ways than we did when I first went to Brazil, or even 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago, when there wasn't much of a middle class, or if there was, it was like an accordion middle class. When hyperinflation took over, the middle class collapsed, and they crawled back out again when things were more or less stable. They've now been stable, for 16 years, and I think they'll remain stable for as many years to see in the future. The explosion in the C class, the middling class, is what is going to drive the market. It's going to drive the commercial real estate market. It is going to bring pressure on the government to increase spending, quality spending on schools and hospitals, because when you're poor and marginal and don't have enough to eat, you don't really think much about going to school, nor do you think very much about not being hungry. But as you move into the middle class and you become a consumer, and you look around at the injustice in Brazilian society, which we could also talk about in the United States, you then, I think, begin to get not only a middle class in economic and consumer terms, but an economic class in political and social terms. Now, are there dangers there? Of course there are. Mobilization is always a dangerous concept in politics, whereas this happening in other countries, I would be more concerned. But as we know, the famous buzzwords in Brazil are always conciliação, conciliation, accommodation, do jeitinho. And at the national level, I think, in terms of policy, we're going to see that happening in large part because both candidates have pointed to what? The pre-SALT income going into the social trust fund that's going to be invested in education and health. Now, will it be? We will have to wait and see. Brazilian politicians are not particularly good at responding to social demands in Brazil. But then, of course, they haven't had 93 million people to worry about in the history of Brazil. And that, I think, is going to begin putting pressure on a hopefully new generation of political leaders who will finally replace the gerontocracy that has governed Brazil, many from before 1964, including former President Sarney, former President of the Senate, and his corrupt family. So as they move out of the political process, and you begin to find space for new people with new constituencies. And that's why the 20%, 19 plus 20%, that Marina Silva received in the election, the first round, is so important. She didn't get it from the poor parts of Brazil. She got it from the intellectual, middle and upper middle class people who live in the south of Brazil, who see her as a symbol of change. This, not talking about Chile today, well, we should talk about Chile. It's fascinating. When I left SAIS, they just had brought out the 19th minor. That in the last election in Brazil last year, there was a bright young man named Ominami who took about 23% of the vote. This is the new generation of younger people in their 40s in politics who weren't politicians, who did other things. He was a filmmaker in Paris. His father was a very famous Marxist revolutionary who was murdered by the Pinochet regime. His stepfather is a member of the Chilean Senate. So we're beginning to get some very interesting new people emerging in politics. They can't change politics. But in the case of Marina Silva, she too is the new Brazil. A woman coming from absolute poverty, who didn't learn to read and write until she was a teenager, who worked her way through school, then became a famous activist, then a member of the Senate, then a member of the cabinet, who left in disgust with the policies of some people in the cabinet of Lula, and now has become a major political force. So combining all of these things, the economics, as well as the very important impact Brazil is having in major global policy arenas, whether it's finance or trade or the environment, clearly the new Brazil is going to be a player. Are there still problems in Brazil? Sure. As I said before, inequality. But poverty has come down. How do you deal with inequality? Not easy, as we're finding in many countries. Chile, for example, a modern country, has the highest inequality and poverty in South America. They've not been able to get at it. So this is a challenge. And we won't talk about the United States and poverty today, but that's a real challenge for the next administration, whether it be the PSDB or the PT, and for the future as well. But I think the basis, and I'll end here, for moving forward on these important policy questions has been put in place in the last 16 years. Paulo, I think, agrees with me. As you move around Brazil and talk to people, as we both travel there frequently, there is, I wouldn't say it's a euphoria, but there is a sense, as the Pew Global report just came out a few weeks ago, Brazilians upbeat about their country despite its problems. And the interesting issue is that Brazilians truly believe now that a solid majority, 62%, describe the current economic situation in Brazil as very or somewhat good. And that is very important as we move forward. They also believe that Brazil is going to become, for example, of those who think the economy is in bad shape, an overwhelming majority of 80% blame the government for their country's economic problems, not the marketplace. And more than half, 55%, say Brazilians themselves are among the top culprits. Changing environment for politics, it seems to me. That's very, very important. And a solid majority of 76% give their government a good rating for its handling of the economy, which, of course, is the basis for the new Brazil and Brazil becoming important. And 87% support Brazil's trade and globalization policies and are very much believe that Brazil is going to become an important country over the next 20 to 25 years. So the trends are very, very good in terms of how Brazilians feel about Brazil, which again, 2014 and 2016 are critical because the next president, if he or she messes it up, they're out after 4 years because the Brazilians want these two things to work. And that's going to require a lot of investment, but that will too be part of the new profile of the new Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Riordan. As you prepare to ask your questions, I would like to start by asking you something, reading the book and knowing some of your previous work, especially the one that I believe is your major intellectual contribution to the knowledge of Brazil, which is the work on politics in a patrimonial society. How do you integrate, how do you see that in the new Brazil? There's some very interesting thing that happened, for instance, with the Workers' Party, that is the new force in Brazilian politics, that starts in the late 70s, actually starts in 1980 as a party, in the industrial area of Brazil, the more modern part of Brazil, and today is a party whose base, whose political base, is very much concentrated in the northeast of Brazil, which is the less developed part of Brazil, the more rural part of Brazil. And by the latest poll, very interesting, by Datafolha, suggests that it's the only region right now where Marina Silva has a very clear advantage over José Serra. How do you fit the new Brazil and the old Brazil together? Because we know that the patrimonial society is still very much there. How do you...
Yes and no. What I thought was interesting, your point is quite correct, that my former student in Pernambuco in the early 1960s, Marco Maciel, who has been vice president, minister of education, mayor of Recife, governor of Pernambuco, lost his re-election bid. Mm-hmm. Marco, who was a young Turk in the 60s and 70s, is now thought to be part of the patrimonial society. And state by state, Jacques Wagner in Bahia, for example, the new governor, PT governor, re-elected in state of Bahia, very much anti the establishment of ACM, Antonio Carlos Magalhães, and that whole bunch of crooks who ran the state of Bahia for decades and decades. It's going to happen very slowly. But what is interesting about what's going to happen under Lula and the Bolsa Familia, is that suddenly the Northeast is awakening. And one of the bright decisions by somebody in Brasilia was to go around the caciques, the political bosses, the state governors, to work through the municipalities and the mayors. So what you're doing is you're empowering usually a younger group of political leaders, men and women, at the municipal level who will begin to work their way up to the state and federal level. It's going to be difficult. Brazil is a complex country. The federal system, as messy as our federal system is, but I think and what's interesting, if you and I know this, the data, voting data between Lula's election in 2002, who elected Lula in 2002? The bourgeoisie, Ipanema, Leblon, São Paulo. Who elected Lula in 2006? The Northeast, because of Bolsa Familia. Dramatic shift in the voting patterns. Not saying it's good or bad, merely that the Brazil that I knew and still know, the Northeast, is awakening. And the awakening is being done how? Through the vote. And because in the old days, in my days in the Northeast of Brazil, governors and their political hacks voted people, literally. We would go around watching the trucks, bringing the peasants in to be voted by their landlords. That's not happening anymore, or very rarely does it happen. So people are voting with their feet. They're voting in favor of good government, that is Bolsa Familia, And these conditional cash transfer programs are fascinating. As you know, they're done by cards. There's no money, there's no paper trail. You just go to the bank and put it into your ATM kind of thing. It goes to the woman in the family, not the man, because he'll drink it. And it is based on real conditions. You've got to vaccinate your children. You've got to get prenatal and postnatal care. You have to have checkups, and it's conditioned. They check up to make sure you're spending the money on what you should. This is why this new consumer class has begun to appear the last 6 or 8 years. They're a confident class. They have, and now the next step, of course, and this is a great debate among my colleagues, all these conditional cash transfer programs really a dole. And what happens is people take the money and decide, I have enough money to buy beer or rice and beans, why go to work? So far, there's no evidence that is the case. But at some point, you probably do need an exit strategy from the Bolsa Familia or to revamp it over time. Mexico has a very impressive program, Oportunidades. One or two other countries are experimenting. Colombia is not very good, unfortunately, for various reasons. But this is a very interesting and new approach to really moving people out of poverty relatively quickly at not great cost. Now, this is not an expensive program in terms of a burden on the budget. So I think in that sense, the new Brazil is a new Brazilian society, a consumer-oriented society, more urban, obviously, as you move forward, and I think more interested, in talking about, large percentages also see corrupt politicians, 79%, and social inequality, 66%, as very big problems. So that is going to, it seems to me, manifest itself in voting patterns and in the way in which the new consumer class begins to look at its political system and at its social structure. Can't do it overnight. It'll move slowly and peacefully, unlike in some of the Andean countries. But I think the tide is now beginning to turn.
And let's give credit to Mexico for having been the first country to experiment this on a large scale, this program, and to the late First Lady, Ruth Cardoso, who was the person who convinced President Cardoso after he saw this program implemented by the Workers' Party government in the Federal District of Brasilia, that this was a good idea, that we should federalize this program. And this was actually recognized by Lula when she died in 2008, and he brought his whole cabinet to the wake in recognition of that fact. So there is more continuity in that. Questions, please. Yes, Howard.
I'm Howard Riordan from CSIS and here at the Wilson Center. Riordan, I remember a conversation that you and I had 5 or 6 years ago in which we were both very pessimistic about Latin America. And without violating the privacy of that conversation, I think we both, at least maybe only half-jokingly, suggested that if we both started our careers over again, we'd study East Asia rather than Latin America. So clearly, things have changed in those 6 or 7 years. Chile has now broken through the World Bank's categories and now is a developed country, and Uruguay, Brazil, Mexico are following very soon in Chile's wake. What, in your view, thinking just, not just of Brazil, but beyond Brazil as well, what has happened in the last 6 or 7 years to account for that? Is it just oil, or is it this vast panoply of things that you've enumerated? What do you, has there been a cultural change? Is it a socioeconomic? What, in your view, as a longtime expert in this field, has really accounted for this change in the last 6 or 7 years? Not just Brazil and the other countries as well.
I think Chile, of course, is very different because of the 1973 coup d'etat, the Chicago Boys, Pinochet, and the fact that in 1990, the concertación of the Christian Democrats and the Socialists understood for stability it was very important to continue with the economic programs that had begun under the Chicago Boys. Repressive regime, good policies in the medium to long term. Key is what Pinochet or his minions did right before the transfer. They made the central bank independent. That drove my colleagues in the Concertación crazy because they wanted to get back into power after being out of power since 1973, and they wanted to get their hands on the central bank to print money, to take care of their buddies. 6 months later, when I was in Chile, they were all saying, thank God Pinochet made the central bank independent because now we have a stable monetary policy. That is also the case in Brazil. Brazil's bank is not independent, it's autonomous. Under 16 years, I think that will continue. That's very important. Contrast a Chile or a Brazil, Peru, independent central bank as well, Mexico as well, with what's happening in Argentina. The crazy Kirchners can't pay their bills, so they destroy the central bank. I mean, there's a building we call the Banco Central de Argentina, and there's a woman who sits there, but she's not really the central bank president. She's a minion of the Casa Rosada and of Cristina Kirchner. Or when Mrs. Kirchner can't pay next month's bills, she nationalizes the private pension systems. That is exactly what you don't want in countries in South America. And you look at the good players, like the Colombias, putting aside ideology and politics, the Colombias, the Perus, the Uruguays, the Brazils, the Chiles, they found a virtuous path. The others have not. The others have fallen into this demagoguery of Correa, who really thinks there was a golpe de Estado against him last week, which no evidence to that point. Or Hugo Chavez, when he's off his meds, is a madman. The most interesting one of all of them, I think, is Evo Morales. I'm not sure the embajador who has been the ambassador of Mexico to Bolivia would agree with me. Interesting in part because somehow Bolivia is growing. And somehow they've been able to deal with the regional problems. So I think there's a real divide between political elites and economic elites who finally came to the conclusion, wouldn't it be nice to be stable, to grow, to export, and to begin to invest in the country? Other elites, for interesting political reasons, in Venezuela it's because the traditional parties were kleptomaniacs, and it collapsed with Chavez's election in 1998. Lots of signals in the 15 years before, but nobody was able to do anything. Nicaragua, failed state. It's not going anywhere under Ortega, unfortunately. But the major countries have begun, I think, to understand the importance of combining the market and the state. And that's going to be a debate in Brazil after the election. Now, if Serra wins, we may see the state pull back a little bit. If Dilma Rousseff wins, we may see the state expand it a little bit, not in a crazy way. The phrase that a lot of us use is a smart state. Somewhat smaller, and we wish the Brazilian state were smaller, more efficient and competitive, and moving ahead with that reform agenda. Because frankly, my second edition of the New Brazil, I wrote in 5 years, if they don't move forward on this agenda, there's not going to be a second edition. Because Brazil does not have a great deal of time to deal with these issues. You can just kick the ball forward, and being a famous soccer country, they're kicking the ball forward all the time. But on these social and infrastructure investments, they just can't wait. In my sense, talking to people in both the private sector and some in the political sector, understand the motivation to do this is not just 2014 and 2016, but this new middle class. This new middle class is going to want better schools, better health, and they're not going to want to pay for it. They want public goods that are of quality, which has never been an issue in the history of Brazil.
Now let's go there and then come down here. The gentleman here. Yes, please.
Thanks. I don't think you touched on this issue, but I'm wondering what the impact, what impact do you think that progress will have on the traditional family structure? As I understand Latin America or most of Brazil, that the center of culture is family, and it appears that, like, for example, in America, that the wealthier we become, it tends to have a negative impact on families. And so I'm wondering, as Brazil progress, will the families kind of scatter or disperse and become more individualistic like Americans?
Interesting point. Thank you very much. And a very kind gentleman bought 3 copies of my book, so I'll give you a long answer.
See, the lady here.
Wait, I have to answer that question.
No, yeah. Please go ahead.
It is an interesting question. We don't know. Sociology tells us you may be right. My own instinct says that for all kinds of interesting historical, Portuguese, Brazilian, networking reasons, it'll be a long time before that happens. I mean, I'm surprised, even at my age, that people are still going to grandma's, if grandma's still alive, for lunch on Saturday or Sunday. The extended family is very important, and Brazilians still live near each other, less than they did 40 years ago. But still, that network becomes very important. Cousins and your uncles and aunts, et cetera, et cetera. I'm always amazed at my Brazilian students, how they seem to spend more time on emailing their family than their fellow students. And because they're always getting inquiries, what are you doing, where are you going, when are you coming home, kind of thing. So that's a very rich part of the Brazilian tradition, which I hope continues. But as the country urbanizes even further, it doesn't have a long way to go to urbanize completely. There may be strains and stresses, but I still, as I travel around Brazil, and others do as well, you still find the family is an important structure.
Now you have more kids going to school in universities in other cities, and you have more, especially junior executives, accepting jobs in other cities and moving. But this is quite new. And the other thing is that Brazil, the demographics in Brazil is that our population will stop growing at 220 million around 2039, according to the latest projections. So it's very interesting what's happening there. Please.
Hi, I'm Julie Schoenthaler with the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. I guess you could say that the U.S.-Brazil relationship, the tone and in terms of tone and depth, has waxed and waned over our history. Recently, you might say it's been distant, if not tense, what with the WTO dispute, and then our differing approaches towards Iran. However, on the other hand, you have various, bilateral MOUs and also the recent Defense Cooperation Agreement. How would you characterize the U.S.-Brazil relationship today and then also into the future? And I guess that might be easier to answer after the 31st. I guess what sort of relationship do you think Brazil seeks with the United States in the future? What opportunities are there for improvement in the relationship? What might be points of collaboration and also maybe some points of disagreement or some challenges for that relationship?
Sure, thanks.
Thanks.
Congressman Meeks is part of your subcommittee now?
Yes.
Good. I owe him a book. But last time I testified, I mentioned I was writing this book, and he said I want a copy of it. So thank you for reminding me about the subcommittee. I'll send one to the congressman. I think we are all struggling with this relationship. My sense is that very bipartisan comment on my 30-plus years in Washington, that there has rarely, if ever, been anyone above Secretary Watson, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, who really understood Brazil. Most of our senior people are trained or came of age under the Cold War, or they're China watchers, or they're concerned about what is Moscow saying, or the special relationship with Brazil, or a whole series of other issues. And therefore Latin America in general, but Brazil specifically, never really quite rises to the level of importance that it does. And I understand the president gets up in the morning and he has Iraq, he has Afghanistan falling apart, the Iraqi can't form a government, there's no Middle East peace agreement, the North Koreans are going crazy. So I would imagine if the president does have a little memo there and says, let's talk about Brazil, he sort of goes, yeah, right, buddy. Let me take care of the other problems. Besides, we have an election coming up. But in a longer distance, I mean, when there has been room for accommodation, there's been accommodation. Brazil and the U.S. have worked on a number of issues that were complementary to their interests. There have been periods in which there were not any issues of complementarity. I mean, during the Cold War, Brazil did not have nuclear weapons, does not have nuclear weapons, so that was never an issue on the table. Brazil has always been a good member of the multilateral organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations Security Council. We could talk about the Security Council if anybody's interested, in terms of Brazil's interest in sitting on it. So in a sense, there was a famous or very well-known book, The Distant Neighbors by Alan Riding about Mexico and the United States. And we are, in a sense, distant neighbors as well, friendly, but not intimate. One probably have to argue that the U.S. relations with Mexico are a good deal more dicey because of the dynamics of the 2,000-mile border. And as Brazil has suddenly come of age, and it's come of age very quickly. Now, you think back to 1985 was a transition from the military regime. Tancredo Neves dies. You get Yo-Yo Sarney, the vice president, becoming president. He's followed by another yo-yo, Collor de Mello. He's followed by a madman, Itamar Franco. And Are we on the record here? And
It's piped live to Brasilia.
the nice thing about
Well,
having...
let me say about Itamar Franco that he was just elected senator. He's 80, and he was the guy who actually brought decency back to the Brazilian government after Collor de Mello resigned not to be impeached. And he was the man who had the inspiration was to nominate a sociologist to run our economy because the economists couldn't do it. And the sociologist is actually the person that stabilized the Brazilian economy. So, you also
know Itamar Franco destroyed the economy in 1999 by not paying his debts. I think that is going to be more important in history than what he did as acting president, quite frankly. But we have our differences on that. That's perfectly all right. As you know, I feel a little heated about the issue. So, in terms of U.S.-Brazilian relations, my sense is that they'll be fine. We were the major trade partner. China is now the major trade partner. If the numbers go as they're going, we may be the third trade partner. Argentina may replace the U.S. Brazil is looking trans-Pacific. It's looking south. China will become India behind it, more important than the United States in terms of trade. Foreign direct investment, we don't know where that's going. As of now, we are still the most important country, of course, in the country. Brazilians, I think, love American products. There's no question. They're great consumers. And that is going to be very important as we move forward. But on the multilateral level, no matter who wins the end of the month, come January 1st, most Americans tend to forget that José Serra, Minister of Health, took on the American pharmaceutical companies over HIV/AIDS, kicked them in the pants and won. Serra is not a pushover for American firms or American interests, and certainly Dilma is not going to be either. So I think the U.S. has to be, again, it's depending on the context of the foreign policy makers. If they truly believe that the Bretton Woods arrangements are still in power, then we're going to have trouble with China, with India. Moscow is a separate issue, and with Brazil. And I think we need to be aware of that. And again, in power cycle theory, let's make sure that the relative decline of the U.S. and the European countries is peaceful, and the rise of the new players is peaceful, and we find more accommodation than we do competition. But that's a very important policy issue that you raise, extraordinarily important, I think.
John.
John Redwood, formerly of the World Bank, now a very happy World Bank retiree. I was interested by the implications of what you said in relation to Bolsa Familia and its impact in terms of helping to expand the Brazilian economy by way of added demand, domestic demand. And of course, China's role is very important in terms of added external demand, particularly with respect to products such as minerals and soybeans that feed Chinese pigs, I understand. But I also very much agree with you that the challenge going forward in terms of the public sector in Brazil is to fix the supply, and maybe particularly in the sectors of education and health. I'd be interested in your views, and those of Paulo as well, by the way, in terms of the extent to which the two finalists for the Brazil presidential election understand that and are likely to actually be able to do something about it in terms of policies, in which I suspect José Serra has an advantage because he's sort of been there and tried to do that, as you just referred, with respect to the health system, but whether that's also true of the education system. Because I see these really as, together with addressing the inequality concerns, which you've also very correctly identified as perhaps the most difficult and persisting problem, this as being a major challenge going forward. So I'd be very interested in your views with respect to that.
Sure, thank you. Dilma Rousseff has said that the free salt is our passport out of poverty. Not clear what she means by that, but I think I know what she means by that. That the social trust fund, is going to be a mechanism to invest relatively large amounts of money, hopefully with great care and targeting, as from the World Bank, that's terribly important, over a period of time. You can't turn the educational system around, though, in a year or two. And I hope that is what the politicians understand. This has got to be a consistent, persistent policy over a generation to bring people public goods. The problem in Brazil is one. If you're the alta burguesia, you wouldn't go near a public school. So you send your kids to private school. you wouldn't send anybody to a public hospital, so you have private clinics. You don't really trust the courts, so you have private arbitration. So at the end of the day, you've built a parallel state. The education system is even more perverse. Unless you go to private primary and private secondary, you can't get into the world-class public universities. Perverse. That's got to be changed. We all know it's got to be changed. The elites think they want to change it or say they want to change it. But, of course, it's the politicians in Brasilia who control the education budget. And, of course, it's their kids who go to private, and then public. And so that has got to be changed dramatically. It's a very important issue, critical. And, as you well know, any report you pick up, World Economic Forum, World Bank, et cetera, says it's human resource development, education that will make the difference for these countries as they move forward. The big issue when I talk to people in Sao Paulo, it's the same issue of 20 years ago. For many companies, they can get lots of engineers and architects and too many lawyers and poets, but they're useless. What they can't get, never enough poets. Okay, I'll try that. Is they can't get educated secondary school graduates who can read a manual, solve problems, take decisions on the floor, and not have to wait for the foreman to come by and say, "Hey, dummy, why don't you do this?" And that is a very serious problem because the private sector high school graduates aren't going to go to work for Ford or Embraer. They're going to want to be a lawyer or a poet when they graduate from USP or one of the great public universities. And so we've got to turn around the incentive system to either get more people of less position in society into the private school system. You can do that with vouchers. You can do it all kinds of ways. Or begin to really improve, and not every public school is bad, obviously, but begin to improve the public schools. But we have all the stories for decades, whereas schools in the northeast of Brazil have semi-literate teachers, if they show up. I remember one education minister 10, 12 years ago at a conference, very elegant man who became education minister of São Paulo State, at a conference in Miami. And we were going on about education and how bad it was, and he got very annoyed. And he said, "I'm going to put a computer in every school in Brazil while I'm Minister of Education." And a Brazilian, thank God, reporter raised his hand and said, "But Mr. Minister, 60% of the schools don't have electricity." He looked totally shocked. Here's this alta burguesia, Paulista, kind of, probably never been to Piauí or Amapá, who goes to those places if you're from the society set in São Paulo. So what you need is some meeting of the minds between what the people who make the decisions are thinking and what they finally do, and really get them to know Brazil. Again, which is why Marina Silva is so important. People now understand that you can be dirt poor and absolutely marginal in Brazilian society, and you can become a federal senator, a federal minister, and a presidential candidate. 25 years ago, we all would have laughed if I'd said to you, "Oh, a woman of dark skin, a very bad social background, you're going to walk her way to the nearest town, begin to study, and then move up, first with Chico Mendes, activist, organizing, rubber gatherers, and then become a federal politician, a statesman." We all would have said, that's one of those telenovelas that we look at on Wednesday night. It isn't really Brazil. It is Brazil today. It's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't tell you how many years, but I remember when I was an office boy at a bank in São Paulo in the mid-'60s. The ads said that among the requirements was boa aparência. It's not being black. That's what it meant. And you cannot run that type of thing in Brazil anymore. The other thing, that Lula, this dimension is very important. President Lula, being the first man of the people to be president and being a successful president, has really broken this barrier in Brazil. People feel represented by government. This is a very important value. On education, I think the forces represented by the PSDB started some very important reforms in Brazil. The forces represented by Lula knowing very well that he would not be successful if he confronted the teachers' unions in Brazil. For the same reason you run risks if you try to do it in Washington, D.C., right? He went around it and established a program at the university level, which is a Bolsa. If you pass the exam to go to a private university, they are normally not as good as the public ones, but they are reasonable. and you have increased dramatically the number of kids in Brazil now attending universities, most of them for the first time, for most families for the first time in their lives because of this program. So I think both sides have interesting ideas, proven ideas, but the main issue, John, is, the reality is that today, at age 15, 50%, 55% of Brazilian kids can read only mechanically. They do not understand what they read. And that is the issue, and that's a shame, and that's really...
The transition is going to be very difficult. I have a very, very bright Paulista student whose father's a taxi driver. And he met a Alta Burguesia girl, and they dated until he finally met the family. And the family said, "What does your father do?" He's a taxi driver. Never saw the girl again. So they're going to have to overcome those issues in this sort of first generation rise of the new sort of empowered young men and women, obviously. But that's tough to overcome any society, as we well know about the United States. That is an issue that the Brazilians, I think, know how to deal with. They're beginning to deal with it. But there's still inroads of very conservative social structures in all Latin American countries, but particularly in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she was probably gorgeous, and he will pay for dumping her for the rest of his life.
That's right.
Noela.
I am Noela, a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson, and also an adoptive daughter of Brazil. In fact, I arrived in Brazil in 1994, just for the new Brazil. So, and I arrived to the first class Brazil to the University of Campinas as well. Well, I wanted to comment something about one point that you stress here about this 30% of the class increase in the class C. And if I think about this, okay, we had in Brazil over the last 8 years some progress because the poor became less poor. But at the same time, the rich stay the same or even they get richer. In the other hand, I think, Lula had a lot of popularity, more than the PT voters. So I wanted you to comment on which groups inside the PT government or within the alliances that the government had over the last 8 years prevented a more important change in terms of redistribution of wealth. I think if you look Brazil in terms of redistribution through taxes, you won't find that there's no distribution. So I wonder if you can comment something about these groups of interest that still are so powerful.
I think Lula had to make some very draconian choices in 2002, as we all know. I work in the market sometime, and the markets went crazy when it became clear that Lula and the PT were going to win. Political risk went through the roof. And Lula already had sent the carta to the Brazilian people, a letter to the Brazilian people saying he was going to maintain fiscal stability, etc. The PT had no option in terms of maintaining or establishing credibility, unless they maintained, many of the programs of President Cardoso, the inflation targeting, the independent central bank, etc. That meant they had to give a very high surplus. That meant there was not a great deal of disposable money for social investment, unfortunately. But what they did do was able to calm the markets, which meant that people bought Brazilian bonds. They were able to get the rating agencies to raise them to investment grade, which is extraordinarily important. And so there were trade-offs. So I think Lula took the Bolsa Familia, a not expensive program, and you're quite right, Ruchi Cardoso was the inspiration for that, as one way of beginning to do as much as he could. He also knew that, as you well know, Brazil is a coalition government. And there probably will never be a two-party system in Brazil, and perhaps there never should be. But to get those kinds of reforms through Congress, he had to establish priorities. And so Social Security came first, some tax reform, some other issues became first. And I think they thought the investment through Bolsa Familia, which I think has paid off very well, would be the first stage. And hopefully, as Dilma Rousseff has said, pre-salt is our passport out of poverty. So that she would then, I think, be much. I would give her much more credit to be aware of these issues. Don't forget, while Lula was president for 8 years, he was only in the palace for 4 years, and Dilma really ran the government for the last 4 years. Lula was doing what? Lula was making Brazil a BRIC. Lula was everywhere. He was in China, and he was at the EU, and he was in Argentina, and he was in the U.S., and he was everywhere, which is part of the new Brazil. This confident president appearing at the G20 meetings and yelling at the finance ministers of Miss Lagarde of France and the others, saying, "You people can't manage your affairs. What's wrong with you people? Look at how I manage my affairs." Which she did. And she didn't take that very well either. Quite an elegant lady from this little fat roly-poly man who can't speak Portuguese very well. And he did the same thing on trade issues in Geneva. His government did. And so I think we have to put that into perspective that Lula inherited a good Brazil, but a weakened Brazil because of the '99 crisis, the energy crisis, a whole series of issues. Brazilians were sick of the PSDB. They wanted a change in 2002. And they got it with Lula. And therefore the PT, and don't forget, he had problems with the PT. Finally, they had to push people out of the PT. The Mensalão, I think, liberated Lula from the PT, which was a good thing for Lula and a good thing for Brazil, given the fact that the original leadership basically were mostly gone, and Lula became Lula during the second term. So, yeah, no doubt, I would love to have had 10 times the amount of money put into social spending. But there's also so much you can do given fiscal constraints, because fiscal constraints drive the market, and the market is what Brazil needed to get where it is today.
Okay, Roberta.
Thank you. Riordan, I would like to go back to the first question from the end of the table, the gentleman left, about what has changed in Latin America and has made it so prosperous in the last years. And I don't want to diminish the virtuous policies that have allowed for continuous growth, but there are two other factors I would like you to discuss. The first one is the rise of China. The fact that so many commodities that China has been demanding has been coming from South America, and its minerals and its soy and so on and so forth, which unfortunately we in Mexico are not exporting at this time, and being an exporter of manufacturers, we have not benefited from this boom. And the second question, very difficult, drugs. There are some Andean countries whose names I've forgotten that seem to export their drugs for reasons of control or wherever south, then to Africa and to Europe and otherwhere. So to what extent this is also a source? I mean, how do we make an accountability of this money-wise? How much is it moving? Where is it going? Who's benefiting from this growing drug trade in the world, especially with cocaine that is only produced in South America? And which routes is taking, and what effect is having in the economy of these countries?
My book before the New Brazil was China's expansion into the Western Hemisphere, so I've thought about China and I've been to China quite a bit. There are winners and losers in working with China, and China knows that. Mexico's a loser. Brazil so far has been a winner. But the real concern, of course, in São Paulo and elsewhere is that if the Brazilians don't get their act together and add value to their exports and diversify their export base, they could become overly dependent, like taking a drug, on China. The good side is that we don't think there's going to be a hard landing in China. And a soft landing in China means 6-7% growth. And what's interesting is you talk to people in Brazil, what's behind China? India. And what's behind India? The other Asian countries that don't produce agricultural goods or minerals. And Brazil, as I mentioned before, is an extraordinary agricultural and commodity giant. So there's a balance there. There's no question that jobs have been lost. Businesses have gone out of business in São Paulo and other places because of cheaply produced high quality goods. That is a challenge for Brazilian industry to become more competitive and more productive. That goes back to education, science and technology training, innovation on the shop floor. Having said that, we then look at the other side of the picture, and what is Brazil producing? Extraordinarily competitive multilateral companies. Natura, Vale, to go down the list. These are extraordinary now. They're spreading around the world. And so there's a very complicated mix of private sector, public sector developments that are going on. But I agree with you. I think that the Brazilians are aware of this, not all Brazilians, but many are, that the strategic relationship with China has good sides and bad sides. In terms of commodity prices and raw material prices, no question that China is paying their bills. They also decided to put $10 billion into Petrobras last year. Frankly, my government doesn't have $10 billion to put anywhere. So that relationship, invest in Petrobras, China gets guaranteed oil supplies from Brazil for 10 years. Those are the kinds of strategic relationships that are being worked out. The drug issue is a very complicated one. If you read the new national security doctrine of the armed forces that came out last year, maybe 15 months ago, they put a great deal of emphasis. Only academics sit down at night and read the national security doctrine of Brazil. But they put a great deal of emphasis on, they don't say this, but on the borders with the drug states. And they're becoming increasingly concerned about incursions across the border from the drug-producing countries as they move down and through. And this, of course, is a threat to Brazilian sovereignty, and armies exist, navies exist to protect the sovereignty of the country, and clearly drugs are now moving up on the agenda of concerns. As we know, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, other places have been steeped in violence because of drug-related crimes. They're again working on that before 2014 and 2016. Very difficult, very, very difficult uphill battle. What can we do? As you know, your Attorney General has said frequently, stop the arms flowing from the U.S. into Mexico, open bank accounts, stop the chemicals going to Colombia to process it. The U.S. government can't act on any of those. And so from the Brazilian point of view, they don't want those three things. I think they wouldn't mind opening some bank accounts to see where this drug money coming through Brazil is going and who are the final recipients. But I think all of the region, 20 years ago, people weren't doing drugs. They're now doing drugs, tragically, because it's so readily available. And I think all the South American countries, as Mexico, obviously, and Mexico, are very concerned about this. And no one has any ready answers. You can't shoot all the drug dealers. If there are laws that protect their bank accounts, which I don't think there should be, but there are, you have to respect those laws. The druggies in Rio and the favelas very often are better armed than a policeman. And there is the whole jurisdiction question between the police and the Army. The Army does not want to get involved in drug fighting, nor should they. But that raises the issue, as in Mexico, the police in Brazil are not paid well, they're not trained well, and until the politicians understand that is the first line of defense, a well-trained, well-paid, prepared police force to deal with these policy questions, and there's growing sense about that, I think. They're not going to make a great deal of progress.
A couple of things, Roberto, on this. On China, you see people now, people in the opposition, people in the government, saying that Brazil should not reproduce some sort of neo-colonial relationship with China, right, being the provider of commodities, although some people in the commodities producing areas say, especially in agriculture, there is a lot of science and technology involved in the production of, I don't know if, Noella, if it's a good argument or not. That's what people in the sector keep saying. The other thing about this is that, curiously, researchers, polls done with what called the foreign policy elites of Brazil see China clearly as a competitor, not as a partner. It's and you keep, they keep asking this question. On the drugs, it's very interesting. President Lula proposed more cooperation among the police forces of South America, which is, it's sort of obvious. It should happen. Brazil is now the second largest consumer of cocaine on earth. And Serra has, during the campaign, tried to use this issue, actually, by going after Bolivia. No traction, but if he manages to get elected president, the issue will be, and he will have to deal with that because he was not the traditionally nice Brazilian talking about the neighbors. He was trying to pick a fight. And if she managed to get elected, so this may become, an important issue. Now, sir, that's...
Thank you. My name is Jai Krishnan, and I work for the government of Singapore, and we on direct investments into Latin America. If you look at the Fortune 500 list, there are, I think, 9 or 10 countries, 10 companies from Latin America, maybe 9 from India, and 46 from China. Okay, granted, maybe many of those have been, state companies and then, privatized down the line. My question really relates to the role of the private sector in Brazil. I think in the introduction to your book, Professor Roett, you mentioned that much of that growth has happened in spite of the state. The question I have is, going forward now with the new administration, probably PT, how fast and how far do you think that administration will take or make the right steps to try and reduce all of those hurdles for the private sector infrastructure? We talked about the tremendous tax burden that nobody knows how to deal with. How fast do you think these pressing issues can be dealt with? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question has already been alluded to, is about Asia. We've seen all the multi-Latinas now emerging. Still a handful, mainly the blue chip Brazilian companies getting into Asia. How fast, again, and how far-reaching is the development of an Asia strategy within the private sector in Brazil taking place? And do you think it's moving fast enough? Thanks.
Thanks. On the reforms, my colleague Chris Garman at Eurasia, and I'm not sure whether he's correct or not, we'll find out next year, believes that tax reform under either president is going to be a reality because they understand through their advisors that this is a real impediment to growth. We'll see whether that's true or not. I believe 2014, 2016 is going to be the big driver for physical infrastructure, not because the private sector necessarily is demanding it, but because the country's reputation depends on it. And the Brazilians, as I said earlier, don't want to be India and the Commonwealth Games. They want to be Brazil and soccer and the Olympics. So I think beginning in January, any president is going to be dealing with those issues, very, very high priority with the BNDES and the private sectors. Public-private partnerships, I think, are going to become much more important in the next government. And as you know, Brazil has some of the world-class construction companies. It isn't the issue of the competence of the construction companies, it's getting through the bureaucracy and getting the permissions and getting all that stuff that one has to do. Whether you can cut through that quickly enough is going to be a real challenge. There's no question about it. I think China is seen as an opportunity for some companies. It's seen as a dragon, negative for many others, which is why they need to develop a strategy, which I don't think they really have at the present time, because so far, since 2004, when Hu Jintao visited Brasilia on his famous Latin American tour, it's been an easy go. Until 2008, commodity prices were very high. Raw material prices were very high. Valley could basically set the price for iron ore every year. That's changed now as well. They're going to quarterly pricing. The Chinese are more concerned about getting involved. Soybeans and the things that China needs desperately can only come from countries like Argentina and Brazil. But it is the competitiveness, productivity issue that is crucial for the next 25 years. The famous resource curse in Latin America is still not yet been put to bed. That all too often, countries can rely on high commodity prices in good times. Now, Chile has not solved it, but dealt with the copper pricing issue with counter-cyclical planning, which has worked very, very well in Chile over the last 10 or 12 years. Brazil hopefully will be able to do that with the pre-salt money as well. That's going to become, I think, terribly important. So the China issue is going to be looming large for South America for a very long period of time. More and more of the countries are dependent on exports to China, but in turn, China's growth is dependent upon imports from Brazil and the Pacific countries in South America.
Yes, here. Actually, if you want to know who will win the election, the Riordan knows, okay? So you can ask that.
My name is Bart Langer. I'm a sociologist, University of Maryland, and I spent a good deal of time in Brazil doing research on technology. My question is about this C class. And clearly the Bolsa Familia is a good thing. It particularly helping children to go to school, improving the nutrition of these families, but I don't think that most of these families are able to buy refrigerators, washing machines, people who are receiving the Bolsa Familia. Now you get to the C class, and I've seen, lots of reports in the press about the growth of the C class. But, I'm thinking, if we say poverty decreases in the United States, it means that a certain percentage of people have risen above the poverty line, which is, ridiculously low. So you have a lot of people above the poverty line are working poor, and can't afford the things that, some basic things in life. So, when the C class grows, the question is, these people entering the C class, those just entering it, I think they also have a difficulty, let's say, buying some of the basic things like refrigerators, washing machine, etc. Even if they, it's 10 times or whatever, 20 times the payments are extended, especially because these items in Brazil are so expensive, so much more expensive than, let's say, in the United States. So this C class, is nice to tout them and say, their middle class is growing, but, by any realistic measure, a large percentage of these people are nowhere in middle class, have a middle class living standard. So I'm wondering what you say. I think if we're not placing more emphasis upon that and making it look as though there's actually more economic progress than there is.
I said before that the C class in Brazil is not the middle class of the United States. But the question is, who's buying all these products? That's the question. People are moving into the consumer market. The evidence is there. It is very clear that the C class is making purchases for the first time in their life. Now, they're not buying everything available in the marketplace or in the shopping malls, but they're buying. Why? Because not only Bolsa Familia, but this is a very complicated question, but also because unemployment keeps going down. Job creation keeps going up. So it's a very interesting mix. Not only the poor are moving into the C class, but people who are at the bottom level of the C class are moving up to the middle and top of the C class. So there's a tremendous amount of mobility going on and a tremendous amount of consumption. Credit is somewhat easier to come by, maybe too easy in some cases. You go to any shopping mall in Recife, Bahia, São Paulo, there are always sales because just as here, merchants know that you put something, a percentage reduction, and people are going to reach out for it and buy it. So there's a euphoria. I mean, again, maybe it's irrational exuberance, but it's there. And these are not my numbers; they're from Ipsos, a very respectable polling company that works in Brazil and around the world. And I think their numbers are right. The C class, and again, not our middle class, has increased by 30 million people, from 34% to 49% of the Brazilian adult population. And that C class is not monolithic. It's a very complicated C1, C2, C3, C4, but they're the ones who are out there buying. And you just look at the numbers coming in each month in terms of what's being sold and consumed. It can't all be going to people who already have refrigerators and televisions. It's going to people who don't have refrigerators and those issues. So I would disagree with you. The data, it seems to me, again, not interpreting it through American eyes, but through Brazilian eyes. And what's interesting is, as you look at the C class growing, what's not growing largely is the AB class. In 2008, there were about 29 million people in the A and B sector, just 30 in 2009. Now, within that, again, you have tremendous ranges, lots of very wealthy people at the top, obviously. But so you have to dissect the numbers. But if you look at consumer patterns and consumption patterns and data coming out monthly in terms of who's buying what, you see a very interesting step up.
Yeah, there is something, probably it's a great field to be, to to do actual research on what's happening. I think IPEA and Fundação Getúlio and others are doing this, because you have a situation where, to go to one of the first questions about mobility there, families pool resources in Brazil a lot. Yeah. So you have a Bolsa Familia here, the emprego, the job there, and people pool resources on all of a sudden. And since the credit is facilitated now, you do buy cars. You do go to poor neighborhoods where they have new cars and talk to a cab driver in Brazil, in São Paulo especially, about the great economic growth of Brazil, and they get desperate because they can barely move already with the congestion. And they say, oh my goodness, the economy is doing well, there will be more people buying cars. And on the other types of products, for instance, Procter & Gamble, we had a meeting recently here with them. They couldn't be happier. Procter & Gamble Brazil, it's still a very small operation of Procter & Gamble in the world. In Mexico, for instance, they're major. In Brazil, they're very small. But they are growing their business in Brazil 30% a year. And they keep saying, oh, those Brazilians are wonderful because they take showers all the time and they brush their teeth, I don't know how many times a day, and they use all the products, and this is this market. And the other thing is that they are intelligent enough to market in small portions, because they know people, you cannot do the Costco there, because people will not buy in bulk, or unless the family organized, but they can buy in. The old thing when I was a teenager, that you buy 2 cigarettes, you don't buy a pack. It is the same sort of thing. So there are, people are, and you can see there when you go, I go to Brazil all the time, and you can see that people are dressing better, are eating more, and have a different sort of disposition. So
a happy face.
A happy face. Let's continue on this side of the table now, and then I move to the other side. Let's go here first, and then Kent. You, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Bill Gilcher from the Goethe Institute German Cultural Center. You mentioned cars. And yes, every time I've been in any Brazilian city, it's horrible in terms of traffic. With the availability of domestic energy produced, Brazil being oil independent, this great temptation, of course, to expand things like plastics industries, automobiles, making all these things which petroleum makes possible. Do you see in the policy of the policy world in the last few years and in the next few years, evidence that serious attention is being paid enough to infrastructure issues like public transportation in cities, but also between cities? There's wonderful air transportation between most Brazilian cities, in my experience, but the old, rusted-out railroads, which are there, are pretty much useless. Although I remember seeing there was a new line planned between Buenos Aires and the south of Brazil anyway. I don't know whether that happened or not. But how do you see those kinds of issues? Because they're really important for this C-class that you're talking about and for the development of a rational, sane future for people in Brazil.
Sure. One of the other interesting issues with the C-class is the C-class travels. Mm-hmm. Planes are loaded. Hotels are loaded. Now, you may be going to stay with your cousin on the beach as well as staying in a hotel, but you're moving around. Brazilians are highly mobile now, and this is the C-class who now understands that they can buy 10 payments, but you still get your ticket. I've been in the airport so often in Rio or São Paulo, and first-time flyer comes up to the counter, totally confused. Never been on a plane before. But they're going to see, the Tia, Joãozinho, blah, 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 and they want to know, do I have to pay you here, or do I? So they're learning, but they're flying, and that's very, very important, I think. On the energies, first. Second, what's very interesting in Brazil is, I'm sure you all know, is that Brazilians don't use petrol to drive their cars. They do either a mix, or they can choose between ethanol, gasoline, or some kind of mix. God forbid that we ever go that way. So they're becoming very competitive in that kind of issue as well. Third, I think there's no question that there's a great deal of concern about physical infrastructure, which I've been talking about. You know, we're going to have the famous railroad finally between Rio and Sao Paulo.
Are we?
Well, you know.
I don't think so.
Do pigs fly? Well, you know, why not? We can try at least. But I think there is a sense that, you know, Lula did reorganize the whole air controller system when you had too many planes crashing. You know, anybody who, like I have for decades, who's flown in and out of the downtown Sao Paulo airport, you just close your eyes, grab the arms of your seat, and hope you're not going to wind up in someone's living room. Because you can see them in a living room if you open your eyes when you fly in. Or if you go to Jobim, I still call it Galeão, but the Jobim airport in Rio de Janeiro, it's kind of like being...
It's the musician, not the minister.
Oh, that's right. You know, it's like being in an airport in, I don't know, Kyrgyzstan or something. I mean, it's just a god-awful airport. So they're going to have to upgrade all of this stuff before 2014 and 2016.
Guarulhos is not much better.
No, it's not. No. Well, that was all done because of Paulo Maluf and...
Oh, well, he is guilty of everything.
We should be. Those are very important concerns. But I think the physical infrastructure is going to drive the government to a large degree. And what's very important about physical infrastructure, it creates more jobs. So the unemployment numbers will go down beginning in 2011, even more than they'd have done. I mean, President Obama would die for the unemployment numbers in Brazil right now before he goes into an election. Die. They're going down, not up. And so they're going to hit 7%, 6.8 by the end of the year. And then with the construction coming in, I see it going down to 5.5, 5.4 in relative. That's a very low number for any country, particularly Brazil.
Kent.
Hi, Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. A week and a half ago, Riordan, you were on a panel with a couple pollsters who said for the first time the evangelical vote was going to be critical in the election, something people were paying attention to. Is there a link here to the new Brazil? Is there an element here of another case of Protestantism and the rise of capitalism?
That's a very interesting point. Having gone to Brazil, I mean, all Brazilians are Catholic, but no one goes to church. So what happened beginning in the 60s and 70s, I remember this very well. You know, first the traditional Protestant churches began coming in the 50s and 60s. And then by the 70s and 80s, the evangelicals were coming in. Then there was a battle between the evangelicals and the Catholic Church, and you had some singing priests and all this nonsense on the part of the Catholics. It didn't work out very well. But there's no question that a large part of Marina Silva's success has been support from the evangelicals. No question about it. And this is a new, not the new element, but a new element in the urban areas, but it's creeping into some of the smaller cities and towns as well. Because there are certain virtues the evangelicals bring that the Catholic Church hasn't quite caught up with yet, and probably never will as long as the dirty old men run the church. And the traditional Protestant churches are declining, relatively speaking. So that's space. And you go to some of these evangelical churches or outside the churches when they're having services. They're really happy, joyous places, not to go to ponderous Roman Catholic stuff. You know, I'm a bad Catholic, so I can say that. I'll come back to the church, of course, when I'm dying, as we all do. But the evangelicals preach a very different work ethic. That's the point. And that work ethic, I think, is a very important part of the C class coming up. And I'll bet more of them are evangelicals than many people in the A-B classes, because the traditional upper classes still tend to want to get their daughters married in the cathedral and that kind of stuff. The C class couldn't care less. What they want is a pastor they can understand, who talks to them, you know, who is in some large cathedral that's in front storefronts very often. There's a lot of stuff attached to it, daycare, these kinds of things that really are very new in Brazil. So I think it's a very, very important point.
And it's part of Brazil's businesses. If you go to Mexico, to Central America, to Africa, some of the evangelists are Brazilians. Yeah. It's a global, it's a global thing now, and it's very, very interesting because they obviously are organizing to do that, and they go and they proselytize, and the gays go there in Portuñol, and they speak Portuñol in Mexico, and they do their thing. More questions? I think we still have the lady there. We're going to get all of you.
Hi, my name is Camille, and I had a question about about the World Cup and the Olympics, and just because I think that the fact that they're going to be held in Brazil is just another reflection of their role in the global scene. I just wanted to know what how you felt about this, especially regarding the Olympics. How you felt about this this contradiction that exists between these very possible forced evictions of favela residents, particularly those people that live in crime-free favelas and that are very organized at the community level, and so that these governments, particularly state governments, if we're talking about Rio, can reflect this optimism that they have for the future as far as their preparations go for the upcoming games.
Yeah, it depends really how the government of Rio de Janeiro handles it. If indeed there is movement and placement and alternative housing provided, that can be a very good thing for the C class. If they sort of brutalize the favelados and drive them out into the street and beat them up, that's not going to be very good for Brazil's image or for the 2014-2016. So my answer, to be serious, is that I think the government of Rio de Janeiro and other governments are thinking seriously about this. But I don't talk to favelados a lot, but it seems to me what you do see on television is the favelados are so hyped about 2014 and 2016. This is their bread and butter on the weekends when they go to the botiquim and have their beer with their buddies in the corner and stuff. That's all they talk about. That's all you talk about in Brazil anyway, soccer, C class.
Used to be. We have calmed down after South Africa.
Oh, okay, yes. You've gotten over that one very, very quickly. Because already you can get a bet from anybody in Brazil they're going to win both 2014 and 2016. God knows how they're going to do it. But, of course, I know. So I think that's the real issue, that there have to be structural changes made, and it's the way in which is there a humane way of doing it or not a humane way of doing it. If it's not humane, Brazil is going to get a bad, bloody reputation for doing that, as we've seen in China and other countries. If there is a way of doing it in a relatively decent and humane way, I think that the people who live in the favelas will be happy to cooperate. That's my impression, my sense. I don't spend a lot of time in favelas anymore. I used to when I was younger, but just my impressions are that is the way it will work out.
Yeah, if you read probably the article in the New York Times the other day about the pacifying police, and that's not only comes from the good heart of the governor and from good ideas that these people have. This comes from pressure from below, right, because the other way was not working, and this seems to provide some good answers. And I think, it's the same thing with corruption in Brazil today. Corruption is apparently the issue that has moved votes in the end and forcing a second round. It's not because, it didn't appear like that. There was internet-based movement. Internet now covers more than 50% Brazilians, and led to a proposal of a law called the Clean Record, the Ficha Limpa, and so there is, society is demanding, is what I think Riordan was talking about, this new middle class. People are demanding more quality in more of everything and with more quality, and including the quality of political life, because people intuitively know that you cannot build a better society with the level of corruption and impunity that exists in Brazil. So it's the same thing with those, how do you treat people? And a lot of people in Brazil happy with the Olympics going to Rio and to Brazil in the World Cup because it set some deadlines for Brazil. There are certain things you have to do by certain dates, and let's get organized. And this is very positive. Let's continue.
One comment.
Yes, sir.
One comment. What's critical about Brazilian political life is the media, the investigatory media, Veja and the newspapers, which are indefatigable in digging out all of these scandals. Irinice, the Casa Civil lady who replaced Dilma with her 10% sons or whatever the God knows is going on. She was out in 3 days as soon as Veja got hold of it. In the street, baby, you're out. And that's beginning to happen more and more in Brazil as very smart young men and women are going into journalism, investigatory journalism, and their publishers are printing the stuff. Even if they run the risk a little bit, we've gone through this in our country with certain kinds of papers many years ago. Do you publish them or not publish them? The Watergate, what were they called? The Pentagon Papers. Well, they don't have a scandal like that in Brazil. What they do have, though, is these young men and women are really digging down and finding out who's doing what to whom. This is how Paulo fell as finance minister. It's how a number of diputados have been fired or had to resign. So there's a certain unwillingness to accept the immunity of the traditional political class anymore. And the idea that a woman who ran the presidential palace, one that was stupid enough to get involved in this, if she was, but she had to leave within 48 hours. She was down with Lula, and Lula said, sayonara, lady.
Yeah.
I don't need you.
One thing in this poll that you mentioned from the Pew Center, very interesting. Lula gets positive ratings from, I think, what is it, 92%? No, 84% of the people, or 82. The Brazilian media comes second with 78. So, and that's why President Lula attacked the media during the Erenice business. After the first round, the governors elected by the PT met and said publicly to him in Brazil, stop attacking the media. You cannot do that. So there is this sort of a democratic dynamic in Brazil that's very strong. Let's continue. Hugh here. No, okay. Go there and come here. And
I grabbed the mic. Dane Smith, former student of Professor Roett's.
See you, Dane. How are you?
Nice to see you, too. I regret to say that I've not been following Brazilian politics as closely as I did 15 years ago when I was in your class, Riordan. But I was wondering...
15 years already?
15 years, yes. I was wondering if the prospect of limited competition for the PT in the political arena actually poses any threat to the movement away from the patrimonial society. So you talked about voters voting in a different way, but does limited competition in any way threaten that dynamic?
Interesting point, Dane. I'm glad you read the patrimonial book in class. Sometimes I worry if my students do the readings. I think what's going to happen after this election, it's not going to be a revolution, is we are going to begin to have some significant party realignment. You know, the old PFL, which was the handmaiden of the PSDB, now called the Dems, I think they're finished. God knows what's going to happen to them, but they're finished. Now, all of a sudden, the Green Party, 10 years ago, if you'd asked me that the Green Party was going to carry 20% of the national vote, I would have said, you're crazy. That was always a bunch of nuts. You know, they worried about grass and, you know, dandelions and that kind of thing. But now they're worried about, now they're concerned about political power. That's a very interesting change. The PSDB is going to have to go through a major reorganization. I mean, they may have won São Paulo and Minas Gerais, but their candidate did not do well. He may win. I'm not saying he won't, but didn't do well in the first round. So I think that we're going to have some significant restructuring within the parties. It's not going to be revolutionary, it won't be overnight, but I think we're going to see some new players coming forward, like the Green Party, the PV. I think we're going to see some of the smaller parties disappearing as voters begin to use their preferences to find more modern thinking parts. The big issue is always the PMDB, the great party, corrupt party of the center, who has the vice presidency on Dilma's ticket. They're going to want everything, including the kitchen sink, if Dilma wins. That's going to be an interesting issue as well. So a lot of things stay the same. Some things I think are going to begin to shift. And the more we see these younger, educated people voting, unlike in Chile, where they're walking away from the ballot box in Chile, they're voting in Brazil. They're really expressing their concern, for better people. And I think that's Aécio Neves was able to elect his candidate in Minas Gerais. If you had asked me 6 months ago whether that would have happened, I would have said, please, what are you smoking? Not what Aécio smokes, I hope. But anyway, that would have been impossible. But it seems to me that this shows that we're having a very distinctive set of changes, younger people who are coming up and beginning to run. Now, as you know, there are bookshelves of proposals of how you change the electoral system, the party system in Brazil. Many of my dear colleagues have written a lot of these books. Do you go to a German system? Do you go to a district voting system? Do you go to proportional plus district? Not going to happen because the politicians are the ones who have to vote themselves out of office. So we're going to have to deal with this messy political system and electoral system for a long time to come. Key issue which my colleague always embarrasses the United States with, is that the Brazilians have a much more competitive and competent electoral system because they use, is it Microsoft?
We use American technology, yes.
American technology. So the votes, polls close, you know the results within 6 to 8 hours. No challenges, no shards, no Florida mess that we always go through every 4 years. That again, is, I think people have a confidence in the system that their vote is going to be counted. And if you live in Amapá or God knows where, it's going to be counted the same way in the national system as somebody living in downtown São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro. That too, I think, has created a sense that democracy is working. My vote counts. They're not stuffing a ballot box as they used to do in my day in the 60s. And the military, of course, didn't bother even recognizing when the votes were taken. That's totally different now. That's a very important move.
Of the 400,000 plus ballot boxes or machines that you use to vote, only 2,000 malfunction. 5 hours after the end of the voting, we had 97.5%. And after 12 hours, we had 100% count.
Yeah.
So this was pretty nice. Hugh.
My name is Hugh Schwartz, and I'm going to identify myself as a former professor of economics at the Federal University of Paraná in the mid-90s, in the mid to late 90s. You mentioned, and it was also mentioned in another panel here about 2 weeks ago, that the worldwide attention, the greater worldwide attention to Brazil on political grounds is due to a considerable extent to its superior economic growth. Now, up until a few years back, Brazilian growth was not better than the Latin American average. Now it's significantly better. At the same time that this is taking place, my impression is that the South and the Southeast continue to be the strongest engines of growth, and the Northeast, where you say there is more support now than before for the new Brazil, are the leaders in pushing for more social goods and for more education, which may have a payoff down the line, but isn't going to in the next couple of years, really. I can't help but wonder if what is being projected then is not a solidification of the Brazilian potential for the medium term, but not for the short term. In the short term, that its current high rate of growth will drop back. There will be the solidification, and only in the 5 to 10 year period will there be a serious possibility of Brazil emerging on the international scene in the way it seems to be at this moment. What's your reaction to that?
Thank you. It also depends on who's up and who's down over the next 3 to 5 years as well. I mean, it's clear that growth is not coming from the bank-broken United States and Western Europe this year or next, and we don't know about 2012. Where the growth is going to be in the emerging market economies. That's clear. World Bank, IMF data, IDB data, World Economic Forum, what you look at, the growth is going to be in the emerging markets and demand and growth. And what makes, I think, Brazil in such a good position, beginning in 2013, 2014, is that it can basically balance whether it's going to export more of raw materials, iron ore, and the world needs iron ore for steel, or whether there's going to be commodities, soybeans, orange juice, or whether there's going to be petroleum or natural gas or ethanol. So that the range of availabilities for Brazil is really quite impressive as you move forward. There's going to be slowdowns, no question. You talk to the finance minister, I don't think he would want Brazil to keep growing at 7 or 8%. I mean, there are real inflationary problems and difficulties, as you know, with that kind of a growth rate. So coming back to 5.5 would be, even that a little bit high, is perfectly reasonable. They will be, certainly. But as Lula has said, what's very interesting is that the next crisis, and we never know where the next crisis is going to come from, it's not going to come from the banking system in Brazil. Banking system in Brazil is solid, more than solid. It is very impressive. So the banking system is fine. There's not going to be any social revolution. Brazilians don't revolt. This is not Bolivia or some of the other Spanish-American countries. There's not going to be a collapse, I don't think, of the social model. Brazil muddles through, but Brazil is doing better now than muddling through. It's going to move from B- to B+ on most questions. If it gets the reform agenda correct, as I said before, over the next 48 years, I think we're in clear territory. But there's no guarantee that's going to happen. I mean, I think you can find, already you find among some politicians, hey, we have all this oil money. We don't do anything. Just increase my salary, increase my benefits. So that's going to be a problem. And that the next president is going to really hold on to that very, very tightly. And if she or he doesn't, then you're quite right. There's going to be some really important structural problems ahead. You still need to deal, as I keep saying, with not only physical infrastructure, but with education and taxation, but with the social security and retirement system. People are still retiring too early and getting paid too much, the public sector employees in particular. Cardoso tried and didn't work. Lula made a little bit of progress on that.
Before I give Alec Watson the opportunity to ask the last question, let me just say something that on a question, related question to what you issued, to what you answer, is very interesting what's going on now, because it looks like the election will be decided in the major cities by the higher educated people that voted for Marina or that are hesitant. There are, 11% of people that may still move their votes, according to the latest poll. And the issue that has not been discussed are, Marina put on the table a dozen issues, including some related to quality and sustainability. And one of the things, for instance, in Brazil, we have not figured out. We are always boast about the quality of our energy matrix. It's really spectacular. It's 47% now of all sources are renewable. Now, how you factor in the pre-salt in that, it's a mystery, right? Because that's dirty energy, fossil fuel. How do you costs and benefits? Or, for instance, we have about 30 hydro plants to be built in the Amazon region, smaller and larger, like the Belo Monte one. How do you factor that? Because that produces lots of energy, but it destroys some big chunk of forest and produces other things. And this discussion is interesting. That is one that we are not having. The two candidates represent very different positions on that. Dilma is mega projects person.
Marina resigned.
Yes, and on the complement of that in foreign policy is that we are going to provide environmental services to the world, so the world better pay for our mitigation efforts here. Serra in São Paulo, the most important industrial state, and to a large extent, I think it's still the most important agricultural state in Brazil, or still there, but in that position, but opted for a different set of priorities and took measures, approved laws in Brazil that points to the creation in São Paulo, to the creation of a carbon market. Those are, can you do both? And this is about strategy. This is about energy policy. And it may be that, in the debates that are still to happen between the two candidates, that they may have to be engaged in that. Some people say, oh, no, come on, Brazilian voters will not bother about that. In this same study of the Pew Center, it's very surprising that of the 22 countries polled, Brazil is the country where a very large majority, the most people in Brazil, 80-some%, consider climate change a very serious issue. More than China, more than the United States, by far. So it may be a very surprise if one of the candidates present this issue and frame the issue. It could be one element in a tight race that helps one side or the other. And stay tuned. Alec.
Well, I came in a little bit late. I apologize for that. But you talked a lot about the C-class throughout this conversation here. And in Mexico, I think in the last couple of days, Luis de la Calle and Luis Rubio have published a book. I believe it's called Clase Mediero.
Clase Medieros.
Mediero, which is pretty interesting because it touches on some of the same themes you're talking about how the development of a middle class in Mexico, despite relatively low growth, has produced a middle class which is going to drive development. And their argument is without a middle class, you can't really have true development. Right. So it's similar to some of the points you've been making. I think it's kind of interesting maybe to make some cross-cultural comparisons at some point. You talked about the resource curse, Riordan, and that leads to sort of the Dutch disease and all that sort of thing. I'm still concerned that the pressure on the Brazilian industrial sector from this overdependence on exports on natural resources could result in at least maybe not the deindustrialization of Brazil, but a retardation of its industrial growth, which is crucial for its eventual development. But that's not my question. My question is, you haven't talked too much about Brazilian foreign policy except to talk about how it's been playing in the BRIC game. And there are a lot of inconsistencies among the BRIC countries. I mean, they aren't really a group except in notionally so. They're trying to meet, and they have met, and they've tried to come up with some points on which they agree, and there are those interests that do coincide, but there are a lot that don't coincide. And I just wonder how you see that working out in the future, and how you see Brazil's relationship with all the countries around it in South America, which throughout its history has been very, very successful in managing. But I can see as Brazil gets more and more powerful, it could be more and more complicated, and Brazil could find itself having more distractions in its own neighborhood, which might inhibit what it does on the larger global sphere.
Sure, those are reasonable points. I think Brazil's position in South America, the whole issue of North America is a very interesting separate question in Brasilia, is that you keep everybody in the tent, including Chavez, Morales, and nobody outside the tent. Washington doesn't quite get that. We keep sending people down trying to convince the Brazilians to do something about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I'm sure the Brazilians say, what do you want us to do? One, there's the issue of sovereignty. Two, there's an issue of potential integration post-Chavez. He won't last forever, although he thinks he will. And third, the Brazilians are very respectful of their neighbors and have been very adroit. They've dealt very nicely with Morales when Morales nationalized the petroleum. They've dealt very nicely with Lugo in Paraguay when it was a question of the Brazilian farmers in Paraguay. What they do, they call them to Brasilia, wine and dine them, give them a couple of $1 million, and send them home first class. And so it basically works out. The most difficult relationship, and nobody wants to talk about it, is with Argentina. With Mercosur, it doesn't function because of Argentina. But what are you going to do with the Kirchners? And so Lula goes to Buenos Aires to meet with the crazy one when he has to. And he shows up at the G20 meetings, and why Argentina is in the G20 I do not know, but that's another anomaly of life in the world today. And so you work with everybody, and you try to make things work. And I think that's what the United States doesn't quite understand. Why are the Brazilians talking to the Venezuelans? Well, because they're South Americans, that's why. And besides, the Brazilians only trouble the Venezuelans. That, again, is why the National Defense Doctrine is very carefully defining the borders and the new role along those borders of the Brazilian military. They're not dummies. The Brazilian military is quite smart compared to quite smart. No more comparisons. Brazilian foreign policy is always, I think, from the future on, is going to be South-South. I mean, IBSA is a good example of that. And I said, maybe before you came in, there's no question the BRIC issue is not a monolith. This is not a new NATO or a new whatever. It's a collection of countries that are growing very fast. The three, not the R. I talked to Jim O'Neill last week, and we put this together at Goldman Sachs. And he said, if I did it again, I probably wouldn't put Russia into BRIC, but it sounded so good in 2001. Which is true.
BIC is not good.
It doesn't make work. And Mexico doesn't make it. South Africa, there are all kinds of ways to play with it. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, in Geneva at the Doha final round in 2008, Brazil disagreed with China and India for very real, practical reasons. On other issues, there's a lot of complementarity. We'll have to see where climate issues go, because the Brazilians, of course, have a very divergent position from that of the Chinese and of the Indians. Some complementarities, but a lot of divergence as well. So I see this as just a new lobby in the context of the G20, for moving the chairs and chairs of the IMF. We're getting some new financial architecture. We're trying to get a new trade round that's more open and transparent for the emerging market countries. And I think that's the way the international system is going to move, and the industrial countries are going to have to develop. What I thought was very interesting, even though it's the year of France in Brazil, how many times has Sarkozy been to Brazil this year? 3? Mm-hmm. With Carla Bruni. Yes. How many times has President Obama been to Brazil with Michelle? 0. Well, I talk to my friends downtown. They say, oh, please, you're making a big mountain out of nothing. Of course he'll go to Brazil. I said, why hasn't he gone to Brazil during the first 2 years? Well, busy. And I'll say, well, yeah, I know, they're all busy. Why has Sarkozy been there for 3 years? No, 3 times. Why? To sell airplanes. But we don't combine in the U.S. commercial policy with diplomacy. The French and the Germans, the others do. A president or a prime minister flies XYZ because there are a couple of $1 billion on the table, and we don't quite get it. Although there is a diplomatic aspect to that that's very, very important. Brasilia loves to receive European prime ministers and European presidents, and they do it very well. This is why Hu Jintao decided to opt for Brazil and not Argentina in 2004. Kirchner treated him terribly. Wait, Kirchner treats everybody terribly, and mostly the Argentine people. But the Brazilians knew how to do this, and they do it very, very well. And so that, I think, is the story as we move forward. Increased professionalism, danger signals with regard to the oil income, issues about the resource dependence, all of which we hope the next government will deal with intelligently.
Well, Riordan, thank you very much. Before we go, let me just tell you, we thought about putting together a panel on the election just before it. We decided to hold on that idea and see, because maybe we are going to do just one after the elections, because, it will be a bunch of speculation, basically, right? And now, the panorama right now indication seems to be that this is tightening. That Dilma Rousseff, I think, still it's hers to lose, but the latest indications are that, she is. This comes from the debate that on Sunday, that she decided to not listen too much to the marketing guys, and went on the attack. And it's sort of, we don't know what is the impact of that. The Serra people were not unhappy about that. And there seems to be a new dynamic here. President Lula himself said this election is far from resolved. President Lula probably knew what he was doing when he bet everything on a first-round victory, because he is the best practitioner of politics in Brazil, and he knew that Dilma, not having never gone through this process, and facing a very experienced politician, could have difficulties. José Serra had 4.5 million votes less than for president than Aécio Neves had in Minas Gerais for senator. He had 2 million votes less than Geraldo Alckmin, people of his own party, for governor of São Paulo. And then there are the 20 million votes for Marina. Most of those seem to be migrating to Serra. Therefore, this could be what actually President Fernando Henrique Cardoso predicted here next door in December. This will be a very tight race. It will be resolved in the second round, obviously, and what will decide is what the message each candidate present and how they deliver this message. I think that we will still have 2 more debates at least. We have one this Sunday, and we have the final one on global television that may actually get as much an audience as a final soccer game. And if we call a meeting, we may call a short notice kind of discussion. Now, another thing, if you're interested, we will have most likely on the 20th of this month, around this time, the Minister of the Environment in Brazil will be in town. She'll come, and we are probably going to do this sort of a by invitation only meeting. But I wanted to, if you're interested, please leave your email with Renata or give a card or something, and we'll send you the invitation. It's going to be a smaller meeting at the 4th floor conference room. Her name is Isabella Teixeira. She is the current minister, and she will be in town. There will be people from the environmental movement with us. Riordan, again, thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.
And
thank you.
Great book. Well,
Thank you very
here
much.
we
I
go.
appreciate that, young man.
Very good.
Thank you for coming, Roberto.
Have a great audience. Oh, glad to meet you. One of the best things I've been to in a long time.
Very nice.
Thank you very much, sir.
Wonderful. Paulo, thank you.
Isabel,
Nice to see you again.
Isabella Teixeira?
Yeah.
Yes, the 20th.
former
Sure.
colleague, former friend.
Huh?
She's going to come, so.
Yeah, please. Se você quiser, dá pra coisa, avisa aí que...
How are you? Nice to see you.